I ended the last class with the claim that there's no natural kind of family, that all of these different kinds of families that we've looked at, all these kinship systems, are cultural ideas that we make real by acting as if they're real. How do we make families real? What kinds of ways do we act? One of the most powerful of these is rituals. So what we're going to do in our case study this week is we're going to look at a very bizarre and exotic example of how people use rituals to construct family. So today's case study is going to be a look at Santa Claus, a particularly interesting American cultural tradition in which parents give gifts to their children under the pretense that these gifts are given by an immortal, red-clad old man with magical powers. This ritual is fascinating because it's enormously widespread in American society. It cuts across boundaries of religion, boundaries of class, and boundaries of race and gender, and other divisions that divide the United States. It's practiced heavily by almost all families. It is deeply embedded in American expressive culture, and yet it's a very strange ritual. And it opens up a series of questions, the most important of which are, first, who is Santa Claus? How did this figure of this mythical gift-giving immortal enter into the American cultural repertoire? And second, why do Americans practice a ritual exchange in which a fat old man in red leaves gifts for children? So we'll begin with the first question. Where did the Santa Claus myth come from? Or in other words, how did a Turkish bishop living in the early days of Christianity evolve into a North American myth about a stout, red-haired old man who associates with elves and flying reindeer and lives at the North Pole? To answer that question, we have to go all the way back and start with St. Nicholas, who was known in his own time, probably not so much as a gift giver, but for his youth. He was called Nicholas the Boy Bishop. Nicholas was probably born in Lycia, in what is nowadays Turkey, around 270 A.D., give or take 50 to 100 years, which tells you how inadequate are the historical documents that historians have to work with in trying to put his life back together. He was born to wealthy parents, merchant parents who had become very wealthy in the merchant marine trade. He was extremely intelligent, very precocious, mastered his Greek and Latin, and was ordained a priest at the very early age of only 19. A few years after being ordained, he took a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and when he returned, as a result of his piety, his intelligence, and his wisdom, he was made a bishop while still in his 20s, hence the epithet, the boy bishop. St. Nicholas was best known in his own era for, in addition to his youth, for fighting against the Arian heresy, for defending Orthodox Christianity. The Arian heresy argued that Jesus was a created being, that the Messiah was called by God or made by God for the purpose of redeeming mankind, and therefore was second to God himself, thus making the Trinity a false doctrine. The Arian heresy was an incredibly important political as well as social and cultural problem at the time. Hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of Christians ascribed to the Arian heresy in spite of council after council of Christian bishops condemning it. And so Nicholas was eventually imprisoned for his activities around 303 A.D., according to the best sources, and then released about 10 years later. So he spent 10 years in prison before being released. He died somewhere around 343 A.D., or maybe 341, or 312, or 287, or 345, or 351, depending on which historical documents you believe in, and was entombed in a sarcophagus in Myra, again, a city in what is today part of Turkey. To understand how St. Nicholas, the boy bishop, became jolly Santa Claus requires us to take some of the concepts we learned from our lecture on globalization and apply them to the globalization of Christianity in the first millennium of the Common Era. So the first concept that is useful in understanding the evolution of St. Nicholas into Santa Claus is one that we're already familiar with, hybridity. The conjoining of two or more previously distinct traditions, institutions, or practices into a stable new system. Now, hybrid cultural forms can also become syncretic. That is, they can integrate so deeply into a society that awareness of their hybrid nature is lost, and the culture just accepts it as a cultural form that's unique to them. And I want to suggest that the beginning of St. Nicholas's evolution into Santa Claus begins with a hybrid and ultimately syncretic process in which St. Nicholas substitutes for the pagan god Poseidon. And this happens through a process that anthropologists have come to call the invention of tradition, after an anthropologist named Eric Hobsbawm. Hobsbawm argued that traditions function to support the status quo in a society. Traditions are invented by societies in response to changing political and economic conditions. So, for example, in America, we have this festival of Thanksgiving, and we imagine it to have begun way back at the beginning, at the founding of our colonies, even before we were a nation state. But in fact, the tradition was pretty much invented in the 19th century by people who wanted to create national rituals that would help new immigrants to the country who were swarming in unprecedented numbers from new parts of the world that had previously not settled in the U.S., and they wanted to help them integrate more fully into American cultural life. Traditions, once invented, are projected into the distant past, and people come to accept those ancient origins as the actual origin of the practice. And then once they've been fully integrated into the society, those traditions are treated as unchanging, or people look at them and they complain that they're changing now, even though we've done them this way traditionally for hundreds of years, usually not knowing the actual history of it. So to understand how St. Nicholas became syncretic with the god Poseidon, you have to understand a little bit about how the merchant vessels operated. In ancient times, nautical technology, especially for medieval Europeans, was very, very inadequate. So vessels would go out into the Mediterranean Sea, and they would go from port to port as quickly as they could, because there was an enormous risk of winter storms causing devastation. People who survived a storm and the loss of a ship would go to a local temple and give a gift or leave a memento in thanks of their having survived. And when Christianity became the religion, the dominant religion, and Poseidon temples disappeared, people still wanted to engage in the practice, and so they would leave these gifts and mementos at temples of St. Nicholas instead. Now, why Nicholas? Well, the reason that they left them at the temple of Nicholas was because he was himself from the merchant class, and so he had in their minds, connection with them, and was someone up in heaven who could look out for them and would intercede for them with God to protect them. And so they would give thanks to St. Nicholas when they survived these kinds of disasters. Now, when miracles begin to be reported about St. Nicholas, the very first miracle on record is not a miracle about gift giving or any of the things that we would think of as associated with Santa Claus, but is rather a miracle in which a ship is suffering from storms at sea, and suddenly the sailors have a vision of St. Nicholas, sometimes surrounded by angels appearing in the sky, and he calms the sea, and the ship is able to make it to port intact. And so as this legend spreads, it enhances St. Nicholas's position as this patron saint of merchant mariners. And so people begin building churches to St. Nicholas, often on the sites of ancient Poseidon shrines and temples. And we find churches of St. Nicholas springing up all over Europe, mostly around port cities. By the late Middle Ages, we find churches of St. Nicholas, most of which still exist in Western European states as well. And so we find 23 churches of St. Nicholas in Holland, 50 just in the city of Münster in Germany, 60 in Rome, 300 churches of St. Nicholas in Belgium, and 400 in England. As the churches spread and the veneration of St. Nicholas spread, new legends about his prowess as a saint began to emerge. He was canonized as a saint by the Eastern Catholic Church in 800 AD, and the first life of St. Nicholas was penned by St. Methodius of Constantinople, a monk, in 842. His biography was translated into Latin about 35, 40 years later. In 1119, Jean of St. Ouen wrote a life of St. Nicholas, another monastic work. About 30 or 40 years after that, Wace of Normandy wrote a life of St. Nicholas in verse. In 1200, Hilarius wrote a musical play about St. Nicholas, and in 1250, Jacobius wrote the Golden Legend, which is the single most important book of saints that established a whole series of stories about St. Nicholas. The next step in the evolution of St. Nicholas into Santa Claus involves the process of commoditization, the process by which things become exchange goods in a market economy. Market economies were beginning to grow around the time that Jacobius penned the Golden Legend, and you have this, and St. Nicholas becomes commodified. To understand this, I want to turn to Igor Kopatov, an economic anthropologist who theorized that commoditization is best looked on as a process of becoming rather than an all-or-none state of being. That is, St. Nicholas didn't start out as a commodity, and he didn't suddenly become a commodity. Rather, gradually, St. Nicholas became more and more valuable in more and more different ways. Kopatov says this happens in two ways. First, things become exchangeable for more and more other things. So what you get a sense that St. Nicholas has value as an object of prayer. He has value as a reason to build a church. He comes to have value for purposes of improving your spiritual life. And so he begins to grow in his economic value. And this is happening concurrent with a second process, which is the growing of market civilization, of market economies. As you'll recall, I explained in our lecture on economics that early on, particularly in places like medieval Europe, markets were not a normal way of life. You couldn't go to a market any day you wanted and exchange money for goods. Markets were specifically established by kings as places where money could be exchanged for goods on certain days at certain times. And markets began to expand in the late Middle Ages. And as they did so, more and more things became exchangeable for more and more other things. Now, where this becomes especially interesting in St. Nicholas is the next part of his evolution was the commoditization of his body, of his remains. Remember, he was entombed in a sarcophagus in Myra, which is now Demre in Turkey, and a group of enterprising thieves from the city of Bari in Italy went to Demre and stole his body from the sarcophagus and carried it off and took it to Bari in Italy. Once Bari had St. Nicholas, all of the Europeans who were involved in the merchant marine and worshipped at these St. Nicholas churches and so on were intensely interested in increasing their spiritual relationship with Nicholas by making a pilgrimage to the site of his remains. And so Bari quickly became one of the premier pilgrimage sites in Europe. The city then profited greatly by supplying room and board for all of these thousands of pilgrims who came every year to Bari to visit St. Nicholas's body. Now, that opens up a whole new question, which is why? What was the value of St. Nicholas's body that would lead people to spend enormous sums of money, to leave their homes, travel across Europe, not always a very safe place, and make their way to this relatively small city in Italy, do veneration for these bones, and then go back home? And the answer has to do with the concept of the commodity sign. The notion of the commodity sign is just a jargony way of drawing attention to something that all advertising and marketing people know, which is that the value of most goods is mainly a symbolic value, not a real value. That is, a value derived from labor or from some intrinsic value of the good itself. It's what it can be used for example. Commodities derive their value from symbolic associations like romance or beauty or prestige or fulfillment, rather than from any kind of value that the item possesses. That's why, for example, last year's car models cost $10,000 less once the new models are out. It's about the newness, not whether or not they will get you where you're going. So what did St. Nicholas symbolize for people that made him such a valuable commodity? Now, the answer to that has to do with a cultural demand for people who call themselves Christians that they lead exemplary lives. And the role of saints, one of the roles of saints in medieval Christianity, was to give you models for how to live an exemplary life. And St. Nicholas is one of the three most popular saints in the late Middle Ages. The most popular saint was St. Mary, who was held up as the ultimate model for any Christian because of her ability to say yes to God when he called upon her. All of mankind is redeemed because Mary said yes to God, and then through her he had the son Jesus, who redeems mankind in the fundamental Christian mythos. The second most popular saint in the Middle Ages was St. Martin. And St. Martin was an ascetic. St. Martin modeled a life of heroic self-giving. St. Martin came from a wealthy family, gave away everything that he had, and lived the life of a mendicant. Stories about him include that someone sees St. Martin going about almost naked, and they say, "Oh my gosh, you must be terribly cold. Here, take my coat." He takes the coat, blesses the man, goes on, and the very first person he meets who is also ill-clad and is a beggar, he takes off the coat and gives it to them. St. Nicholas was the third most popular saint. St. Nicholas offered a very different way of being Christian. He offered a mundane model as opposed to an ascetic model. He raised the possibility that one could be rich and still be a saint if one lived a life of saintliness with one's money. If one used one's money to do good, one could be good while still being wealthy. And he represented this because he himself came from a wealthy merchant marine family. And so we start to get stories of St. Nicholas as a gift giver beginning to get more prominence than stories about St. Nicholas as a merchant mariner. You can see why in an era where feudalism is on the wane and urban centers are on the rise and they're linked by great trade routes and they're ruled by merchants who, councils of merchants, many of whom are richer than kings. You can see why a character like the new St. Nicholas would be attractive. He is rich, he comes from a rich family, and yet he is able to do good, and he's able to enter heaven, and he's able to work miracles. It's around this time that St. Nicholas becomes associated with gift giving. One of the stories in the Golden Legend is a story about how St. Nicholas saves three young maidens from sexual slavery. When they're in their father's poverty, he has no dowry, he can't marry them off, he's going to sell them. And St. Nicholas drops a ball of gold down the chimney before each one, the night before each one is to be sold. And this falls into the girls' stockings, which are hung up by the chimney to dry. And this gold ball then becomes her dowry. And St. Nicholas gives this gift anonymously by dropping it down the chimney rather than letting people know that he is saving these girls. And at the very last time, saving the third girl, the merchant finds out who it is. And this legend is only one of many written about St. Nicholas. But what we find in the High Middle Ages is we find these gift-giving stories start to be the stories told more often, and the older stories about St. Nicholas saving people at sea begin to decline and tend to be told less often and narratized in Christmas plays less often. So we've seen how St. Nicholas shifted from being a minor Eastern Christian religious leader to being a major symbolic figure in medieval European Christian mythology. But how did he get associated with Christmas? This process begins in the 16th century with the Protestant Reformation, which sought to reinvent Christianity in a form more suitable to a new world of capitalism, nation-states, and printing presses, under the guise of simplifying it and stripping it of unchristian elements. This turned out to be difficult because these supposedly unchristian practices went very deep. In England alone, Christmas celebrations included practices that could be traced back through layers of cultural traditions, including ancient Druidic celebrations of the Yule, Roman Saturnalia, Saxon celebrations in honor of Lord Winter, and Viking celebrations in the wintertime honoring Odin the Wanderer. At the time of the Reformation, Christmas was celebrated by great public revels, including huge bonfires, public feasts, wassailing, mumming, and masks, and all of this being overseen by a mysterious, magical figure called Father Christmas, who encouraged eating, drinking, and revelry. These celebrations of revelry were often condemned by church officials who saw them as having pagan roots. But they were also often attempted to be Christianized, and so the meanings of them were given a Christian veneer, so that rather than having to fight against practices that were extremely popular, the church would try to bring them into the church. Early Christian practices were extremely sophisticated in their understanding of how one took pagan practices and Christianized them. We have a papal bull from the 11th century that very clearly lays out for missionaries how they are supposed to work. For example, it suggests that if you come into a community where they perform rites of veneration to a tree, rather than try to eliminate the practice altogether, you try to change the reference of the tree, so that if they are worshiping the tree because it stands for the Yggdrasil, the world tree that of their pagan mythology, you tell them that they can continue to venerate the cross as the tree as Christians, but that now it should stand for the wood of the cross. And over generations, the meaning of the original pagan meaning of the veneration of the tree will give way to the new Christian meaning. As part of this, they wanted to Christianize the kinds of Christmas practices that were going on throughout Europe. Part of this was to replace the Father Christmas figure, who had connotations of ancient pagan gods, with St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas was an ideal figure because he was a very popular saint. He had a winter feast day, December the 6th, and he was associated with gift-giving. Another widespread custom involved the anointing of a boy bishop on St. Nicholas's Day. The bishop would step down and a young boy would be put in his place and would reign until St. Innocent's Day on December 28th. In the 1650s, a Puritan revolution in England cast out the king and his church and sought to purify Christianity of these kinds of practices, which the Church of England had allowed to continue. Christmas celebrations were outlawed on the grounds that they were leftover Catholic practices with no place in authentic Christian life. And with St. Nicholas demoted, Father Christmas, the pre-Christian figure, made a comeback. And he stayed a significant symbol even after the Church of England was restored and many high church rituals were restored to the Protestant Church of England. Martin Luther's efforts to re-Christianize Christians also had unanticipated consequences. The Protestant reformer moved the date on which Christians gave gifts from St. Nicholas's Day to Christmas, and he changed the giver of gifts from the Catholic bishop St. Nicholas to the Christ child or Christkindlin. In popular imagination, though, the Christkindl quickly took on the attributes of a fairy or an angel, and got a servant, a disreputable giant, variously named Schimmelritter or Weihnachtsmann, Ruhklaus, Bullerklaus, Krampus, Aschenklaus, or Pelznickel. Public ceremonies of Christmas were also banned in other Protestant-majority European countries. In Holland, Flanders, and Belgium, curfews were placed on some days forbidding people to give gifts. St. Nicholas was secularized by being renamed Sankt Herr Claus or Sinterklaas, and he got a servant, a Moor from Spain named Black Peter. Sinterklaas himself was said to come from Spain to give his gifts, often carrying oranges as one of his initial gifts. Okay, so that's a lot of historical data, and I don't expect you to remember all of the details. The important thing is that what's happening in England and what's happening in Germany and what's happening in the lowlands and elsewhere in Europe are all examples of a common set of cultural processes that are taking place. The first process we can call resyncretization. During the Reformation, efforts were made by the new state powers to ban Christmas celebrations in order to distinguish Reformed Christianity from popery. Second, popular celebrations continued, but pagan elements were reintroduced or re-emphasized since the Christianized pagan elements had been cast out. These pagan elements were in turn secularized. That is, they came to be associated with the season, not with their original pagan religious meanings. So simultaneous with this effort by religious authorities to resyncretize Christmas symbols, St. Nicholas underwent a process of secularization, in which symbols and practices are emptied of their specific religious content and integrated into society in new ways. The religious content of the symbols and practices becomes domesticated, literally removed from public life and relegated to private life. And finally, hybrid symbols emerge, which can be read as either sacred or secular, depending on the position in society of the family practicing these particular kinds of Christmas rituals. While all these processes are happening in the old world, a new world has been discovered. And it's in the new world that St. Nicholas will evolve completely into Santa Claus, and where Santa Claus rituals will become incorporated into American cultural practices. How did Santa come to America? St. Nicholas came to the New World at least as early as the 12th century, where we find a Viking cathedral in Greenland named after him. 3 centuries later, Christopher Columbus named a port in Santo Domingo St. Nicholas. The Spanish founded a town called St. Nicholas Ferry in Florida. It still exists. Today it's called Jacksonville. The Dutch brought Sinterklaas and St. Nick to New Amsterdam, and the Germans brought the Christkindl, renamed the Christkringle, to Pennsylvania. You probably learned in school that the early colonies in the United States were established by people who wanted to have freedom of religion. And that's true as far as it goes. But with the exception of Rhode Island, most of these colonies didn't want to give freedom of religion to the people living in the colonies. True to their Protestant roots, most colonies banned Christmas celebrations as too popish. A peculiar secularization occurred in Pennsylvania, where Martin Luther's Christkindl became a character called Christkringle. The angelic servant and the angelic child and his disreputable servant merged into a single roguish but lovable gift-giver. And German Lutheran gift exchange practices merged with British Christmas revels to create new hybrid practices. But perhaps the most important state for Santa Claus evolution was New York, as the center of 18th and 19th century mass media. From early on, New Yorkers claimed St. Nicholas for political reasons. Wealthy patriots wanting U.S. independence formed a St. Nicholas Society to contrast with the St. George Society and the St. Andrew Society that were populated by those who wanted to stay British colonists. But there was another even more important political movement. In 18th and early 19th century New York, Christmas was celebrated with public revels, including public drunkenness, vandalism, wassailing that sometimes turned into outright extortion of the wealthy by the poor, and violence was often reported. These things were of great concern to a group of New York intellectuals called the Knickerbockers, who met at the St. Nicholas Hotel. Most were members of the New York Historical Society, and they belonged to a pseudo-Dutch patrician class of wealthy and culturally important New York society. The most famous of these was nowadays is probably Washington Irving, author of a book called The Sketchbook and The History of New York, both of which mention all kinds of historical Christmas celebrations. Another Knickerbocker was James Kirk Paulding, Washington Irving's brother-in-law, who was at the time the best-known and highest-paid writer in America. One of his best-selling books was The Book of St. Nicholas, which sought to integrate the Dutch figure of St. Nicholas into contemporary colonial life. The best-known work from the Knickerbockers today is probably the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, which was written by Clement Moore and published for the first time in 1823. In creating their historical accounts of Christmas practices in New York, the Knickerbockers were involved in what was essentially a political project. They were trying to reinvent Christmas traditions in such a way as to domesticate them, to take them away from the kinds of public revelry and to end these kinds of public practices and bring Christmas into the home. In doing so, of course, they also ended one of the very few practices through which the poor could directly confront the wealthy and ask them for, or even demand of them, gifts of food and drink and even money. New York was an important place for establishing the image of Santa Claus because it became the center of American mass media in the 18th and 19th centuries. At this time, the U.S. was experiencing an unprecedented wave of immigration from countries that didn't speak the traditional colonial languages of English, Dutch, or French, and were often rural and uneducated and brought strange customs into the United States. New forms of media sprang up to try to help enculturate these newcomers to American cultures. These included Harper's Weekly magazine in 1857, the Ladies' Home Journal, and St. Nicholas magazine in 1873. Mass media employed visual artists who began creating a unified look for Santa Claus. The most famous of these, or most important of these magazines, may have been St. Nicholas magazine, which was especially important in establishing a domesticated, secularized Santa Claus for children in the U.S. First published in 1873, it was aimed at children ages 5 to 18. Its first editor was Mary Mapes Dodge, author of the children's bestseller Hans Brinker and the Silver Skates. Her assistant editor was Frank R. Stockton. When I was a kid, you couldn't get through junior high school without reading his short story, The Lady and the Tiger. And the magazine shaped family life in the U.S. for over 60 years until it was finally killed by the World War II paper shortage and published its last issue in 1941. Now, this New York media employed a number of artists who shaped the image of Santa. The most important of these was probably Thomas Nast, the same artist who invented the Democrat donkey and Republican elephant for political cartoons. His Civil War covers for Harper's, with Santa Claus bringing gifts to the U.S. soldiers, elicited an enormous public response, so Santa Claus became a regular feature every December. In addition to his magazine covers, he also produced a best-selling book of colored illustrations of Santa Claus, many of which also then became postcards and greeting cards that were sent to people at Christmas time. Another important artist, many years later, was Norman Rockwell, who introduced Santa Claus into several advertisements before becoming famous for his Saturday Evening Post magazine covers. But perhaps the most important artist was Haddon Sundblom, who created Coca-Cola ads featuring Santa Claus for decades, establishing that the red of Santa's suit was the same shade as the Coca-Cola logo, and eliminating all the last elements of pre-Christian roguishness, making him jolly and happy and tying him iconically to the American dream. Coca-Cola, of course, wasn't the first to use Santa Claus for advertising and marketing. The first recorded incident was a department store in Philadelphia in 1841, which hired someone to be Kris Kringle and to descend from a chimney. In 1846, the same department store, Parkinson's, advertised itself as Kris Kringle's headquarters. In 1867, Macy's in New York opened until midnight every Christmas Eve so that people could make sure to get presents for their children. In 1874, Macy's created their first window display with a Christmas theme and ultimately became famous for this practice. And in 1880, the Boston store in Brockton, Massachusetts, hired its first Santa, and then Santa Clauses became common in department stores ever since. The crucial point is that Santa Claus enjoyed a long and storied career in U.S. mass media from the 18th century to the 21st. Media borrowed images from one another, and the image of Santa Claus gradually became standardized. Even more interesting is that the image of Santa Claus itself became commoditized. Santa Claus, that is, not only delivered goods, but became a good that could be purchased. Okay, so now we know where Santa Claus came from and how he became part of the American cultural repertoire. What we don't yet know is why we do it. What is the point of Santa Claus rituals in American society at Christmas time? That's the subject of the second part of this lecture.